The night had grown heavy with silence, broken only by the distant crackle of sporadic gunfire echoing through the ravine, and the pinned-down SEAL team could feel the weight of hopelessness pressing against their bones as if the mountains themselves had turned hostile. They had come in quiet, slipping past the ridgeline under the cover of shadows, confident that their extraction plan would work, but nothing had gone as planned. The enemy had been waiting for them, ambush prepared with deadly precision, and now hours had stretched into eternity as the men counted their dwindling ammunition and fought off wave after wave of relentless insurgents who seemed to crawl out of every cave and shadow. And despite their training, their grit, their oath to never quit, they knew deep down that the math was no longer on their side, because even the best warriors could not defeat a tide without support, and the promised support, air cover that had been scheduled long ago, had never arrived. Maybe because of weather, maybe because of miscommunication, maybe because fate had decided to push them to the edge, and it was here, in this place of desperation, that reality set in, that grim awareness that for the first time in their careers, for the first time in the mythic history of the teams, they might actually be left behind. Commander Reeves leaned against a rock slick with his own blood, staring at the horizon that was beginning to gray with the approach of dawn, and his men, hardened veterans with scars and eyes carved from war, sat in silence, some muttering prayers, some checking magazines that clinked empty, and when the next barrage of tracer rounds lit up the ridge, none of them surged with the same fire as before, because bodies and minds both have limits, and those limits were now screaming. The radio had been silent for too long, static biting their ears, until finally one of the younger SEALs, Garcia, slammed it down in frustration, cursing under his breath that they were ghosts already, their mission a failure, their story ending in these forgotten mountains, and no one contradicted him because sometimes silence is agreement, and in that silence Reeves let his thoughts wander to his family, to the men beside him, to the weight of leadership that tasted bitter when there was nothing left to lead toward, and then, just when the sky was beginning to glow faint with that cruel suggestion of a new day, the sound came, a distant low growl that was not thunder, not wind, not artillery, but something deeper, mechanical, alive, and all heads lifted, eyes scanning the sky as the hum grew into a roar, and though no one dared to believe at first, hearts began to pound because hope is a strange thing, it can be buried under despair yet resurrect in an instant, and when the silhouette finally broke through the gray, the outline of a beastly aircraft with wings like straight blades and engines screaming power, Reeves felt a surge he hadn't felt in years. Because that was no ordinary plane, that was an A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, a flying monster built for one thing, close air support, death from above, and the men knew instantly that whoever was flying it had answered a call no one else had, that in their darkest hour someone had decided they were not to be left behind. The radio crackled alive with a calm voice, steady and unwavering, Viper 1 on station. I see you boys down there, hang tight, and something in that voice carried not just professionalism but resolve, a razor edge wrapped in warmth, and Garcia whispered in disbelief, it's a woman, as if that detail made the miracle more surreal, but Reeves didn't care who was in the cockpit, all that mattered was the storm she carried, and within seconds the air tore open as the Warthog swooped low, its G8 Avenger cannon unleashing a torrent of 30mm shells that ripped the mountainside apart, fire and smoke blooming like the earth itself was erupting, and the insurgents, who had moments before been so confident now scattered like ants under boiling water, their formation shredded, their courage burned away, and the SEALs, battered and bloodied, stared in awe as the sky screamed in their favor for the first time that night. The woman above did not falter, her voice calm over the comms as she rolled through strike after strike, precision carving safe zones around the SEALs, her jet banking against the rising sun like a predator circling its prey, and Reeves felt his chest swell with something between pride and disbelief, because when even his men had given up, when he himself had nearly surrendered to the inevitable, she had come, not with promises but with fire, not with words but with war, and in that single moment, in the thunder of her cannon and the calm of her tone, the impossible turned possible again, and though the battle was far from over, the story of that night had already been rewritten. The SEALs were not dead, not yet, because she had taken the sky, and with her, hope had returned, roaring louder than fear. The mountain valley was no longer silent, it shook with the relentless thunder of the Warthog's wrath, and the SEALs who had been half resigned to death now found themselves pressed against the earth not in surrender but in awe, their eyes following the silver-gray beast above as it roared low, engines bellowing like some ancient war god resurrected to fight on their side. And in the cockpit, Captain Kara Holt gripped the stick with calm precision, her eyes narrowing behind her visor as she scanned the ridgeline for threats, every muscle in her body tuned to the rhythm of battle, because she had not come here for glory or recognition, She had come because she had heard the desperate call, a garbled transmission almost lost to static, but something in it had cut through every layer of protocol and caution, the voice of soldiers about to be erased, men who had fought until their last magazine, and Kara had known. She could not stand down, not while she still had fuel, not while she still had rounds to give. Her jet rolled sharply, and the Avenger cannon spat again, a wall of fire tearing apart an insurgent position where machine guns had pinned the SEALs for hours, the mountain rocks splintering under the barrage, and down below Reeves shouted at his men to get ready, because he could sense what was happening. The tide had turned, and the enemy who had thought themselves hunters were now prey. Panic running through their ranks as the A-10 scream echoed like a death sentence. Yet even as Kara shredded targets with brutal efficiency, she knew this was not over. The insurgents were not untrained rabble, they had prepared for a fight like this, they had anti-air hidden somewhere, and the challenge now was not just to keep the SEALs alive but to survive long enough herself to finish the job. And when the first plume of smoke streaked up from the treeline, a shoulder-fired missile blazing toward her, Kara pulled hard on the stick, flares spitting bright as she banked away, the missile trailing only to detonate harmlessly in the sky, and Reeves clenched his fists as he watched, because even angels, it seemed, were not invulnerable. Kara's voice came through the comm steady as steel, "Stay low, keep tight, I've got you covered." And those words, simple as they were, rebuilt the SEAL spirit brick by brick, because it was not just air support they had been given, it was leadership, the kind of leadership born from someone who understood that abandoning comrades was never an option, and they moved, crawling, sprinting, dragging the wounded, shifting from one broken wall of stone to the next as Kara carved a path with her fire, her aircraft slicing through the sky with a predator's grace. Still, the enemy was not breaking completely, they were regrouping higher on the ridge, trying to box the SEALs in for one final push. And Reeves knew if they didn't reach the extraction point soon, it could still all end here, but now with Kara above, he had a chance, and sometimes a chance was all warriors needed. He radioed her, voice ragged but firm, "Viper 1, this is Iron Hand, we're moving east toward the riverbed, we need you to keep the ridges clean," and her reply came sharp and immediate, "Copy that, Iron Hand, no one touches you while I'm in the sky." And then she dove, the cannon roaring again, a sound so fierce that Garcia muttered it was like God clearing his throat, and in truth, it felt that way because the weapon wasn't just metal and fire, it was salvation. Yet the battle dragged them deeper into the valley, each step a gamble, each burst of enemy fire a reminder that survival was still being contested. And above them Kara danced between life and death, weaving through tracer fire, evading heat seekers, her heart steady because she had trained for years for this, nights upon nights of repetition until the aircraft was part of her soul, and tonight all of that training had crystallized into one singular mission. Do not let them die. She remembered her father's voice, himself a veteran pilot lost in a war long past, telling her that real courage wasn't medals or missions, it was answering when no one else did, and as she lined up another strike, she whispered to herself that this was her answer. Down below, Reeves felt a surge of something he had almost forgotten, not just the will to fight but the will to live, and he barked at his men with new fire in his throat, telling them they would make it out because someone up there believed they deserved to, and when a commander believes, his men believe too, and so they pushed, dragging themselves out of despair step by painful step, every blast from Kara's cannon buying them another yard of ground. But the enemy had seen enough, their leaders shouting orders, their fighters pouring down the ridges in waves, RPGs launching, rifles hammering, and the SEALs were forced into one last stand at the edge of the riverbed, bullets cracking the stones around them, and for a moment it seemed the weight would crash down again, until Kara came screaming low, so low they could see the battle-worn paint on her fuselage, and she unleashed hell itself, a barrage so violent the ground shook as if the mountains were trembling in fear, insurgents torn apart, positions obliterated, and in that firestorm the SEALs moved, slipping into the riverbed, dragging their wounded, bloodied but alive, because she had made a corridor of destruction for them to pass through. Reeves dropped to his knees once they reached cover, chest heaving, eyes on the sky where she banked once more, and for the first time since the ambush began he smiled, not because they were safe, not yet, but because hope was no longer a fragile dream, it was a living, roaring machine above them, and as long as Kara Holt flew, they would not die forgotten in these mountains. The riverbed was shallow, rocks jutting out like jagged bones, and the SEALs crouched low as bullets hissed overhead, their bodies battered, their ammo nearly spent, but their spirits burning hotter now because of the warriors circling above them, and Kara Holt, locked into her cockpit, felt the weight of every second pressing down on her because she knew fuel was running thinner with every pass and her payload was not infinite, yet she refused to pull back, refused to consider leaving, because down there were men who had already been written off by their own command, men who had fought until they could fight no more, and if she left now they would be erased like dust in the valley, and she would never forgive herself. So she pushed her warthog harder, its engines groaning under the strain of brutal maneuvers, the smell of hydraulic fluid and heated metal filling her senses even through the sealed cockpit. But she welcomed it because the jet was alive with her, and together they were not just machine and pilot but avenger and guardian. Reeves, wiping blood from his brow, looked at Garcia, who was clutching his rifle with shaking hands, and told him to breathe, that they were still in this fight, and even as exhaustion clawed at them, the truth of those words became undeniable when another wave of insurgents tried to cross the ridgeline and Kara swooped in, unleashing hell once more, the Gu-8's roar so deafening it drowned out even the screams of their enemies, and the ground lit with fire, fragments of rock and flesh showering the valley, and the SEALs moved again inch by inch, crawling toward the rendezvous coordinates Reeves had burned into his mind long before the mission began. But the enemy refused to break completely. They adapted, clever and desperate, hauling up heavier weapons, mortars thumping into the earth, explosions shaking the air, and Kara's voice came over the comms, tight now, not out of fear but from the strain of juggling too many threats. Iron Hand, I've got multiple tubes lighting up on the northern ridge, I'm going to sweep them, stay down, and Reeves answered back with nothing but trust. Copy Viper 1, we're in your hands, because at this point her word had become law to him, and she dove, rolling the warthog onto its side, lining up the enemy position with perfect calculation before releasing a pair of AGM-65 Mavericks, and the missile screamed into the ridge, erupting in explosions so vast the shockwave rippled through the SEAL's bones, dust clouding the valley like a storm, and when it cleared the mortar pits were nothing but smoking craters. The men below cheered raggedly, voices hoarse but alive, and Kara allowed herself the smallest grin behind her oxygen mask, though it vanished quickly when her warning alarms blared. Another missile lock, this time from deeper in the valley, heavier, more advanced, a hidden launcher that had been waiting for her to exhaust her runs, and the missile streaked upward with lethal intent. Kara yanked the stick, flares exploding behind her, and for a heartbeat Reeves thought she was gone, the missile following relentlessly, until at the last second she pulled a brutal dive, skimming the valley floor so low dust exploded behind her wings, and the missile slammed into the mountainside instead, detonating in a spray of rock, and the SEALs roared with relief, their belief in her now unshakable, as if she were invincible. But Kara knew better. She was mortal, her jet was scarred, her systems strained, and she could not stay forever, yet her resolve hardened. Because if she had to burn out every drop of fuel and fire every last round to see these men safe, she would, no hesitation. Reeves gathered his team, bloodied faces staring at him through sweat and dust, and he shouted above the chaos that they had to push one last mile to the extraction point, that the bird in the sky was giving them a chance and they would not waste it, and so they rose, carrying their wounded, stumbling forward while Kara carved away anything that dared block them. Her passes so precise it seemed impossible she wasn't on the ground beside them, guiding them step for step. Still the enemy pressed, more trucks arriving, headlights slicing through the dawn mist, fighters pouring out with fresh rage, determined to bury the SEALs before they could escape, and Kara felt her fury rise, because it was no longer just about mission or orders, it was personal now, personal because these men had been abandoned by their own and she would not let the enemy write the ending, so she armed her last strafing run, lined up the convoy, and unleashed the Avenger in a final storm, tearing the lead vehicles apart, fuel igniting into fireballs that lit the valley like a second sunrise, the shockwave tumbling fighters into chaos, and Reeves took the moment, screaming at his men to sprint with everything left in them, their boots pounding against the rocky earth, lungs burning, hearts hammering, until the distant sound of rotor blades thundered over the horizon. Extraction had finally come, Black Hawks sweeping in low, their side gunners already spitting fire into the chaos, and the SEALs waved, shouted, signaled with flares, and the helicopters dropped into the clearing just as Kara pulled high, circling above like a guardian angel watching her wards escape. The men scrambled aboard, dragging their wounded, rifles still firing back at the enemy, and Reeves was the last to climb, looking back one final time at the valley that had nearly become their grave, and then up to the sky where the A-10 still roared. And he saluted, a gesture of silent respect, because without her they would not be leaving, without her their story would have ended in dust and silence, but instead they were alive, carrying scars and memories they would never forget, and as the Black Hawks lifted into the brightening dawn, Kara's voice came over the comms one last time, steady, calm, unbroken. Safe travels, Iron Hand. I'll stay on station until you're clear, and Reeves, throat raw, replied with the only words that mattered, we owe you everything, Viper 1, and then he sank into the vibrating hull, eyes closing at last, because exhaustion could finally claim him, knowing they had been saved, not by chance, not by miracle, but by a pilot who had refused to let them fall when even the SEALs had given up. The Black Hawks thundered eastward, blades chopping through the rising dawn, the SEALs inside slumped against the metal walls, bloodied, bruised, but alive, and for a fleeting moment the weight of survival pressed heavier than the weight of death had minutes before, because surviving meant carrying the memory, the fire, the images that would never leave them. Yet above them Kara Holt remained, circling in her Scar to 10, the Warthog limping slightly from shrapnel damage but still fierce, and she refused to turn away, because she knew too well that missions never ended at the first sign of safety. They ended when every last threat was silenced, and so she kept her eyes on the terrain below, scanning ridgelines for movement, scanning the valleys for engines, because she could not shake the instinct that the enemy had not yet finished, that they would chase the SEALs even into extraction, and as if summoned by her suspicion, the ground erupted in distant flashes, more insurgent convoys pushing through the mountain passes, determined to intercept, their zeal not broken by the devastation she had already unleashed but stoked by vengeance, and Kara's jaw tightened because she had nothing left in her bays except her cannon and a few scattered rounds, fuel gauges dipping lower than she liked, but retreat was never a word that lived in her bones, so she banked, dove, and came down like a hawk upon the first convoy, unleashing her remaining bursts in a precise arc, vehicles erupting into twisted metal, the road choked with fire, and though she bought the helicopters a few more minutes of breathing room, she knew it would not be enough, because for every truck she destroyed, 2 more seemed to crawl out of the mountains. Inside the lead Black Hawk, Reeves was awake again, staring through the open side door at the chaos below, his chest clenching with equal parts gratitude and dread, because Kara was still fighting alone, and he muttered under his breath that she was carrying too much, that it wasn't right for one pilot to shoulder a war's worth of weight, but there was nothing he could do except pray she had the strength to see it through, because their lives were tethered to her courage like rope to an anchor. Kara's breathing slowed into the measured cadence she had trained for, her mind falling into that razor focus that cut away fear and left only calculation. But beneath the precision there was something deeper, a burning thread of defiance, because all her life she had been told in quiet whispers that she did not belong in the cockpit of a machine built for war, that a woman's place was anywhere but here, and though she had long since silenced the doubters with skill and discipline, tonight was the crucible that would etch her truth forever, because tonight she was the shield between death and the forgotten, and as long as she drew breath, she would not let them be erased. Her engine screamed as she climbed and dove again, ripping across the convoy with another savage run, explosions rippling through the pass, but alarms blared. In her cockpit, fuel reserves dipping dangerously into the red, warning lights flashing like angry eyes, and she exhaled slowly, knowing the choice before her: pull back now and save herself, or stay until the very last moment and risk never making it home. And she laughed bitterly in her helmet because to her there had never really been a choice at all. Home meant nothing if it meant leaving these men to die, so she pressed on. The insurgents below fired wildly at her, tracer rounds clawing at the sky, RPGs streaking like fireflies, and yet the Warthog endured, its armor shrugging off blows that would have shredded lesser aircraft, and Kara kept striking until her cannon's barrels glowed red, every burst carving seconds for the Black Hawks to gain distance, and Reeves, watching through the haze of smoke, felt the weight of what he was witnessing, that he and his men were not simply being saved, they were being carried by her will alone, and in that moment he swore silently that her name would never be forgotten, that no official report, no silence from command would erase what she had done here. Still the battle chased them, the helicopters weaving through the valleys as insurgents tried to flank with hidden launchers, and Kara, now nearly dry on ammo, resorted to diving low just to intimidate, her sheer presence breaking formations, the scream of her engines scattering fighters who could not match her ferocity, and for a while it worked, but her gauges screamed louder. Fuel almost gone, and she radioed Reeves, her voice calm but edged with truth: "Iron Hand, I'm nearly dry, you're going to have to make the rest of this run without me." And for a heartbeat Reeves felt panic return, but then her tone sharpened, steady, unyielding: "You're clear enough now, you'll make it, just keep moving." And those words were enough because she had already given more than anyone had the right to ask. And yet Reeves couldn't stop himself, his throat raw as he barked back: "You've done enough, Holt, don't you dare go down here." And though she did not answer with words, her silence carried a smile he could not see. Kara angled her jet one final time, rolling hard into the sun, casting her shadow across the valley as if to brand it with her defiance, and she soared alongside the helicopters for a brief, glorious moment, engines howling in unison with the rotor blades, and the SEALs, battered and broken, raised their fists toward her in salute, a bond forged in fire and blood, and Reeves held his gaze on her jet until it finally banked away, climbing into the endless blue, dwindling into a speck that disappeared beyond the horizon, and though his heart ached with the fear that she might never make it back, it also burned with the certainty that what she had done would live forever in the marrow of every man who had survived because of her. Because even when they had given up, even when they had surrendered to the dark, she had risen, she had taken the sky, and through her they had found life again. And Reeves closed his eyes, whispering to himself not a prayer but a vow, that someday, somehow, the world would know her name. And the night she saved the forgotten warriors of the valley, the helicopters thundered across the mountains until the jagged ridgelines gave way to barren plains, and though the SEALs inside could barely keep their eyes open, battered by exhaustion and pain, their minds stayed locked on the image of the lone A-10 peeling away into the rising sun, because even after everything they had seen in their careers, nothing compared to the defiance of that moment, the stubborn grace of one pilot holding back death with steel wings and unyielding fire. And Reeves especially could not let go of it, his body slumped but his eyes burning as he thought of how close they had come to being erased, how close command had come to writing them off entirely, and how only Kara Holt's refusal had carved their story back into existence. And he knew even before their boots touched friendly ground that what she had done would never appear in the official record, because that was how the machine worked. Losses were accepted, failures buried, and miracles ignored when they did not fit the narrative. But Reeves made a vow in the silence of the helicopter cabin that he would never let her sacrifice be hidden, that if it cost him his career, he would still make the world know what had happened in that valley. Hours later, when the Black Hawks landed at a forward operating base and the surviving SEALs were rushed into the arms of medics, the scene was chaos, bandages and morphine and shouted orders. But through it all, Reeves kept his head turning, scanning the sky, waiting for the sight of her jet, praying that she had found enough fuel, enough strength to limp back to base. And when finally the dull roar came faint from the horizon, he stepped out of the medical tent against every order, ignoring his own wounds, and stood in the dirt as the A-10 appeared like a scarred ghost, smoke trailing faintly from its fuselage, its paint scorched and pocked, and yet still flying, still defiant. And Reeves felt a surge in his chest that nearly buckled him, because she had made it, she had come back, and when her wheels kissed the runway with sparks and she rolled to a trembling stop, mechanics and ground crew rushing like ants to swarm the wounded machine, Reeves limped forward, ignoring his blood-soaked uniform, pushing past anyone who tried to stop him until he reached the ladder where Kara finally pulled off her helmet. Her hair was plastered with sweat, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but she looked down at him with the same steady calm she had carried in the sky. And Reeves, who had seen war carve men into stone, felt something crack inside as he saluted her, sharp and unwavering despite the blood dripping down his arm. And Kara blinked, then returned the salute without a word, because words could not carry the weight of what they had shared in that valley. Later, after medics forced Reeves onto a stretcher and Kara disappeared into debriefings, the machine of the military began to turn. Reports written, damage logged, missions categorized, and as expected, the official story reduced everything to numbers: enemy combatants neutralized, SEAL team extracted, 1 A-10 expending full load, no mention of desperation, no mention of abandonment, no mention of how one pilot had ignored protocol and saved lives that higher command had already consigned to the grave. And Reeves read the draft of the report with fury rising in his veins, crumpling the paper in his fist, because the truth was being erased even as the wounds still bled. That night he found Kara sitting alone by her jet, the ground crew having patched what they could, her silhouette quiet against the moonlight, and he walked up slowly, his limp heavy, his bandages still fresh, and he said nothing at first, because what do you say to someone who has already given you back your life? But finally he managed, "They're going to bury it, Kara, they're going to bury what you did out there," and she gave a tired smile. Not bitter, not surprised, just weary, and she said, "They always do, Reeves. That's not why we do it." And though he understood her meaning, that soldiers fight not for recognition but for each other, he also felt a rage that this kind of courage, this kind of sacrifice, would vanish into silence. So he swore aloud, "Then I'll tell it myself. I'll make damn sure no one forgets." And she shook her head gently, almost amused, replying, "Then it won't be my story anymore. It'll be yours. And maybe that's how it's supposed to be." And with that she stood, pressing a hand against his shoulder, her eyes heavy but fierce, and she walked away into the shadows, leaving him with a weight heavier than any rifle he had carried. The following weeks blurred into recovery for the SEALs, wounds healing, nightmares circling, but through it all Kara's name was spoken like a prayer among them, whispered in the dark when fear crept in, spoken with reverence when doubt threatened, because they all knew that night had been different, that night had crossed some line where even the hardest of them had felt the touch of hopelessness, and only she had pulled them back, and while official briefings never once mentioned her by name, within the team she became immortal, a ghost in the sky who had fought when even they could not. Reeves, though, was not satisfied with memory alone. He began to write, not reports, not classified summaries, but raw words on paper, accounts of the valley, of the moment they gave up, of the moment she came screaming through the dawn, and he wrote with fire in his veins, with a fury that refused to let her story be lost, because he knew men like him faded quickly in the machine of war, but words could last, and so night after night he bled onto the page, crafting not a report but a testament, something that one day, even long after they were gone, might be found and read, and the world would finally know of the day even the seals gave up, until she took the sky. And as he wrote, as he healed, as he carried the weight of every dead man's face and every saved man's breath, he began to understand that perhaps this was the true victory, not just survival but remembrance, because in remembering they defied the silence, and Kara Holt, whether the world ever knew her name or not, had already become more than flesh. She had become the living proof that even in the darkest valley, one person's refusal could change the fate of many, and that was a truth no buried report could ever erase. Weeks passed, the mission faded into the endless churn of reports and deployments. The SEAL teams scattered back into the rhythm of recovery and new orders, and on the surface it seemed as though the valley had become just another forgotten battle swallowed by the machine, but Reeves could not let it go, not when he woke each night with the sound of the G8 still echoing in his bones, not when he looked at his men and saw in their eyes the silent gratitude for a pilot they might never see again. And so he began digging, searching through channels, pulling strings, demanding answers about Kara Holt, the woman who had carried them when even they had given up. And what he found only deepened his fury, because her file was buried in layers of bureaucracy, stripped of details, sanitized, her name barely whispered in halls where careers were traded like currency, and worse, there were whispers of reprimand, that her choice to burn through every round, to risk her own aircraft and defy strict fuel protocols, had put her at odds with superiors who measured war not in lives but in numbers, and Reeves clenched his fists at the thought, because the truth was plain to him. If Kara had followed the rules, he and his men would be corpses in a valley grave, and yet here the system was preparing to treat her not as a hero but as a problem, and he swore he would not allow it. Meanwhile Kara herself carried on with the same quiet resolve she always had, flying missions, writing her own reports, never speaking of what had happened except in the rare solitude of her own thoughts, and in those thoughts she returned again and again to her father's words, the memory of his hand on her shoulder when she was a child watching jets thunder into the sky, his voice telling her that the measure of a pilot wasn't how high they could climb but how low they were willing to go to protect those on the ground, and though he had been gone for years, lost in a war that left only folded flags and silence, Kara felt his presence most strongly in that valley, as if in those desperate dives she had been flying not just for herself but for him, proving that his blood and lessons had not been in vain. Still, the weight lingered because she had seen in the eyes of those SEALs something raw, something that haunted her more than the enemy fire. She had seen their surrender, their belief that death had finally claimed them, and pulling them back from that edge had left her with a strange ache, a responsibility she could not explain, because now she carried not just her own survival but the knowledge that they were alive only because she refused to quit, and that kind of knowledge was heavy. Reeves finally managed to track her down on base weeks later, his body mostly healed but his limp permanent now, a mark of the valley that would never leave him, and when he found her she was sitting again by her jet, the same quiet silhouette against twilight, and he approached with the same mix of reverence and defiance. Because though she had saved him, he would not let her walk alone under the shadow of reprimand, and when she looked up at him, exhaustion in her eyes but also that same unbreakable steadiness, he said simply, "They don't see it, Kara, they don't understand, but I do, and I'm not going to stop until they do too." And she tilted her head, studying him like she studied the terrain from her cockpit, and finally replied, "Reeves, the only ones who need to understand are the ones who made it out. The rest, it's just noise." But Reeves shook his head, fire in his voice. "No. You don't get to disappear into silence. You carried us when we had nothing left. That story has to live even if I have to carve it into the walls myself." And for a long moment they just stared at each other, the weight of war between them, until Kara gave the faintest nod, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, as if she knew she could not stop him from trying. In the following days Reeves began speaking to anyone who would listen. Other commanders, journalists who had clearance, even politicians with connections, and though most doors slammed in his face, a few cracks began to open, small acknowledgments that something extraordinary had happened in that valley, and whispers of the Warthog Angel began to circulate in corners of the military, stories told quietly in barracks and hangars, passed like folklore, Each version different but all carrying the same truth, that when even the SEALs had given up, a lone A-10 had refused to, and though Kara herself ignored the stories, focusing only on the next mission, Reeves felt a grim satisfaction that the silence was beginning to fracture. Yet for Kara the story wasn't about legends or names, it was about the men who had lived, about Reeves and Garcia and the others, and she carried their faces with her into every sortie, a silent reminder that rules and numbers meant nothing compared to the lives depending on her steel wings, and when she sat in her cockpit with her hands on the stick, she felt not fear but clarity, the clarity of someone who had already faced the darkest valley and chosen not to break. And though she rarely smiled, sometimes in the quiet of the sky she allowed herself a small one, because she knew she had done what her father had always told her to, she had gone low, low enough to lift others back up. Reeves, watching from the ground when he could, saw in her not just a pilot but something larger, something immortal already, and he knew the fight to make the world remember her was just beginning, but he also knew that no matter what happened in the hearts of those who had lived through that night she would never fade, and perhaps that was the truest form of immortality a warrior could ask for. Kara Holt had always known the sky would be both her freedom and her burden, because from the time she was a little girl standing barefoot on the tarmac of a dusty airfield watching her father's squadron roar into the blue, she had felt something inside her chest ignite, a hunger not for glory but for belonging, for that unshakable purpose she saw etched into her father's face when he returned from missions, eyes weary but proud, and though the world around her often whispered that daughters were meant for safer dreams, she ignored them, chasing instead the thunder of engines, building paper models of jets while her friends played with dolls, sneaking into the hangar when she could just to sit inside the cockpit of an old trainer that no longer flew, pretending her hands were on the stick, her voice steady in comms, and it was her father who encouraged her, who told her that the sky belonged to anyone willing to bleed for it, and he taught her to never let others define her place, lessons that became the armor she would wear long after he was gone, because war claimed him before she turned 16, a sudden explosion overseas, a folded flag and a silence that never lifted from her mother's eyes, and Kara swore that day not to let his legacy vanish, that she would take the path he had walked even if it killed her, and so she entered the academy with a fire so fierce it burned through every sneer, every doubter, every whisper that she was chasing a man's dream, because she knew it was not his dream but hers, forged from his blood but alive in her bones, and though the path was brutal, endless drills, instructors who pushed harder because they wanted to see her fail, peers who questioned her place, she never wavered, never gave them the satisfaction of seeing her break, and each time she climbed into a cockpit she felt the same surge she had as a girl, the sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be. When she earned her wings and chose the A-10, many were surprised because the Warthog was not sleek, not glamorous, not the kind of aircraft young pilots boasted about, but Kara knew its purpose, knew it was built to fly low, to take punishment, to deliver fire for those on the ground, and she chose it because it was honest, because it was a machine that existed solely to protect others, and that was the kind of warrior she wanted to be. Her first missions were uneventful, routine patrols, long hours circling skies without ever firing a shot, and some part of her feared she would never be tested, never know if she had the steel her father had carried, but then came the valley, that night when the SEALs had been left to die and everything sharpened, every lesson, every doubt, every scar she had carried it all focused into that single decision to stay when others would have turned away, and though Reeves and his men saw it as a miracle, for Kara it was simply the inevitable outcome of a life spent preparing for that exact moment. Yet even heroes are human, and in the quiet after the chaos, Kara often found herself haunted not by what she had done but by what could have happened, by the image of the missile that nearly found her, by the possibility that she could have burned in the valley and been forgotten without even her name whispered, and those nights she would sit by her jet long after the hangar had emptied, tracing her hand over the scars in its armor as if they were her own, whispering her father's words to herself like a prayer, telling herself that courage wasn't about surviving but about choosing the fight anyway. Reeves, when he learned more of her past, felt his respect deepen, because he realized she was not just a pilot who had saved them but a soul who had been forged in grief and fire long before that night, and he told his men her story in pieces, careful not to betray her privacy but unwilling to let her humanity be lost behind the myth, and soon the legend of the Warthog Angel carried not just tales of steel and fire but the truth of a daughter carrying her father's legacy, a truth that gave the story a heartbeat. Kara herself avoided the attention, she waved off the whispers, focusing only on her duty, but sometimes when she was alone she allowed herself to think of her father watching from some distant horizon, and she wondered if he was proud, if he saw that she had taken his lessons and carved them into reality, and though no voice ever answered, The feeling in her chest when she flew told her that pride was there, unspoken but eternal. Still, she carried the weight of the valley not as triumph but as responsibility, because she knew there would be other valleys, other men abandoned, and she could not save them all, and that truth gnawed at her even as Reeves fought to spread her story, because to her it was never about legend, never about recognition, it was simply about answering the call when no one else would, and she prayed silently that when the next call came, she would have the strength again to rise, to dive, to refuse to let go, because that was who she was, who she had always been since the day a little girl watched jets climb into the sky and swore she would never let her father's shadow be the end of her story. Months turned into seasons, deployments shifted, operations rose and fell in the endless rhythm of war, but the night in the valley refused to fade, living not in official reports but in the whispered stories passed from unit to unit, from pilot to ground soldier, from veteran to recruit, until the legend of the Warthog Angel became a quiet thread stitched into the fabric of those who fought. And Reeves, now back stateside for a brief rotation, found himself haunted not by the darkness of that night, but by the light that had torn through it, and he carried Kara's name like a weapon, speaking it in every briefing, every conversation, challenging anyone who tried to dismiss her as just another pilot, because to him she was proof that courage was not measured in orders followed but in lives saved when no one else would act. And though some rolled their eyes, others listened, and slowly the story began to take shape beyond his control. Articles written in niche military journals, anonymous accounts surfacing on forums, each one adding another layer until her shadow stretched far beyond the valley. Kara, meanwhile, continued flying, her jet patched and scarred but always ready, and she carried herself with the same quiet resolve, never chasing the myth, never feeding it, but never denying it either, because she understood that legends were not owned by those who lived them but by those who needed them, and if her story gave some young soldier the belief that they could hold on 1 second longer in the darkest night, then perhaps that was enough. Still, she remained wary of the attention because fame was dangerous, fame turned heroes into targets and myths into burdens, and she had never wanted to be either. She had only ever wanted to be a pilot who answered when the call came, yet deep inside she could not help but feel a strange warmth when she thought of Reeves and his men, alive, breathing, laughing even, carrying futures that would have been ashes without her, and, though she rarely let herself dwell on it, those memories reminded her why she flew, why she chose the Warthog, why she embraced the sky not as freedom but as responsibility. Reeves visited her one final time before redeployment, finding her again by her jet, as if the machine and the woman were bound together, and he told her quietly that the legend was spreading whether she liked it or not, that her name was whispered now across bases and barracks, and she shook her head with that tired half-smile replying, "Then make sure they remember it right, Reeves? Not as some angel. Not as some miracle. Just as a pilot who wouldn't let you go," and he promised he would, though he knew even then that legends never stayed simple. They grew, they twisted, they became something larger than the truth, but he also knew that beneath the myth, the core of her story would endure, because he would not allow it to vanish. When he deployed again with a new team, he carried her story like a shield, telling it on long nights when fear crept in, reminding his men that even when hope dies, someone out there might still answer, and he saw in their eyes the same spark he had felt when her shadow first crossed the valley, and he knew she was still saving lives even from miles away. Kara herself flew into countless other skies, some uneventful, some marked by fire and chaos, and though none ever matched the crucible of the valley, each one carried echoes of it, and each time she strapped into the cockpit she felt the weight of those echoes settle into her bones, and she welcomed it because it reminded her that she was not flying for medals or recognition but for the faces she might never meet, for the ground soldiers who would never know her name, for the men and women who would live because she refused to quit. And so the story of that night became both myth and truth, living in two worlds at once, one filled with rumor and reverence, the other filled with the raw memory of blood and fire, and perhaps that was fitting because war itself was always both myth and truth, legend and scar, and Kara Holt became a part of that fabric, not by choice but by necessity, not because she sought it but because she could not do otherwise. Years later, when Reeves was older and the war had long since shifted into new fronts, he would still sit sometimes in the quiet of his home, medals gathering dust on shelves, and he would think back to that night, to the smell of gunpowder and the taste of despair, and to the sound that had broken through it all, the roar of an A-10 ripping the sky apart, and he would whisper her name to himself, Kara Holt, because it still felt wrong that the world did not shout it, and yet he also knew that true greatness rarely needed to be shouted, that sometimes it was enough for a few men to carry it forever in their hearts, and as long as he lived he would carry it. And Kara, still flying, still answering the calls no one else wanted, would never think of herself as legend, never claimed the title the world whispered, but she would always remember the valley, always remember the men who had given up until she refused to, and she would keep flying because the sky was her burden and her gift, and she knew that somewhere out there another valley waited, another desperate call would come, and when it did she would be there, engine screaming, cannon roaring, because that was who she was, who she had always been, the pilot who would not let them go, and though the story would twist and change with every telling, the truth would remain unshaken, that even when the SEALs themselves had surrendered to the dark, Kara Holt had taken the sky, and in doing so she had proven that sometimes one defiant soul is enough to turn despair into hope, silence into thunder, and death into life, and that truth would outlive them all.
The end.